April 29th, 1945. The morning arrived at Dachau with a silence that felt heavier than the years of screaming that had preceded it. The iron gates, which had swallowed thousands and returned so few, stood open for the first time in 12 years without guards flanking them. The chains that had held them shut lay in the mud, cut cleanly by American bolt cutters that gleamed in the weak spring sunlight. Beyond those gates, a dirt road stretched toward a world the prisoners had been told no longer existed. The American soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division had arrived 2 hours before dawn, their boots crunching on gravel as they moved through the compound with weapons raised, expecting resistance that never came. The SS guards had fled during the night, leaving behind only the evidence of their cruelty. When the Americans finally opened the barracks doors, what they found was not jubilation, but paralysis. In the women's section of the camp, near the southern fence, a little girl stood with her mother outside Barrack 17. The child was perhaps 6 years old, though malnutrition had shrunk her frame to that of a 4-year-old. Her name was Anna, and she clutched a broken doll made from rags and string. Her mother, Elsa, held her daughter's hand with a grip that had long ago stopped being protective and had become something else, a grip that said, "If I let go, you disappear." They watched as an American soldier approached, his uniform dusty from the road, his rifle slung across his back with a casualness that seemed impossible. He was young, perhaps 22, with sunburned skin and eyes that carried the exhaustion of too many battlefields. His name was Private James Donnelly from Brooklyn, and he thought he was prepared for Dachau. He was wrong. Donnelly pulled out a Hershey bar from his jacket pocket, its brown wrapper crinkled but intact. He held it out toward Anna, his hand steady despite the trembling he felt inside. The little girl stared at the chocolate bar as if it were a snake. Her eyes, too large for her hollow face, fixed on the object with an intensity that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with fear. Her mother's hand tightened on her shoulder, and Elsa's eyes darted instinctively toward the guard towers, but the towers were empty now, the machine guns silent. Still, the woman could not shake the feeling that this was a test. Donnelly saw the fear and understood it. He crouched down slowly, making himself smaller, and placed the chocolate bar gently on the ground between himself and the child. Then he stepped back, his hands raised slightly, palms open, in a gesture that said, "I am not here to hurt you." Anna's eyes followed the chocolate as it settled in the dust. She looked up at her mother, seeking permission, seeking some way to understand what this strange moment meant. Elsa's face was a landscape of conflict. Her rational mind knew the war was over, but rationality had no power over the instincts that had kept her alive. Those instincts screamed that kindness was always a prelude to cruelty, that gifts were always traps. Around them, similar scenes unfolded across the camp. American soldiers had set up tables in the central courtyard, distributing soup and bread to prisoners who approached with the hesitation of ghosts. Some accepted the food with trembling hands and immediately hid it under their shirts. Others refused entirely, backing away with eyes full of suspicion. One elderly man shouted in German that the food was poisoned. Near the fence, a woman began to weep, not tears of joy, but tears of confusion. Her husband stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, but his face was empty of expression. He had stopped feeling anything months ago. Freedom felt exactly like captivity, only with open gates. Back at Barrack 17, the chocolate bar remained untouched. Anna had not moved. Else had not loosened her grip. Private Donnelly waited with a patience that surprised him. Minutes passed. The sun climbed higher. Then Anna did something that would stay with Donnelly for the rest of his life. She took one small step forward. Just one. She crouched down and reached out with fingers that looked like twigs. She touched the chocolate bar with one finger, then pulled back quickly. When nothing happened, she touched it again. This time she picked it up. Anna held the chocolate in both hands, staring at it with an expression that was not quite wonder and not quite fear. She looked up at the soldier, searching his face for the trap. Donnelly smiled and nodded. The gesture said, "It's yours. It's real." But Anna didn't eat it. She couldn't. Instead, she clutched the chocolate to her chest and stepped back against her mother's legs. Mother and daughter stood together. holding the chocolate bar as if it were a sacred object, while around them the camp slowly began to understand that the gates were truly open. Yet opening gates and freeing minds were two entirely different things. The little girl's mother remembered a time before the camp, before the fear, when her daughter had laughed at the taste of strawberries. That memory felt like it belonged to someone else now, a woman who no longer existed. But as she watched the American soldier's patient face, something stirred in the darkness where hope used to live. What if this wasn't a trick? What if the nightmare had actually ended? The question terrified her more than any beating ever had, because if she allowed herself to believe and was wrong, the disappointment might finally break what little remained of her spirit. So she stood frozen between two impossibilities, trusting the enemy who had become her savior, or rejecting the salvation she had prayed for every night for 3 years. Across the compound, the Americans moved with a gentleness that felt unnatural to those who watched. They spoke in soft voices, their hands open and empty of weapons as they approached groups of prisoners huddled in doorways. But softness itself had become suspicious. The prisoners had learned a language over the years, a vocabulary of survival written in blows and deprivation. In that language, quiet voices meant greater danger, and smiles meant punishment was coming. The Americans were speaking a different language entirely, one the prisoners had forgotten how to understand. Private Donnelly remained crouched near Anna and her mother, giving them space while making it clear he wasn't leaving. He had been told in briefings that some prisoners might resist help. The trauma did strange things to the mind. But nothing had prepared him for this particular kind of resistance, the resistance of people who wanted desperately to accept help, but physically could not make themselves reach for it. It was like watching people drown while refusing to grab the rope, not out of stubbornness, but because they had been conditioned to believe every rope was designed to strangle them. A few meters away, Corporal William Chen held out a canteen of water to an elderly German man whose lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. The man stared at the canteen as if it contained poison. He shook his head violently and backed against the barrack wall, his hands raised defensively. Chen lowered the canteen slowly and set it on the ground, then stepped away. He had learned this technique at Buchenwald. Offer, retreat, wait. Give them control over something, anything, after years of having no control at all. In the camp's medical barracks, American medics were discovering that the physical wounds were often easier to treat than the invisible ones. A nurse named Lieutenant Sarah Morrison knelt beside a woman who had collapsed from exhaustion. The woman's body was accepting the IV fluids, but her eyes remained fixed on the door, watching, waiting for the moment when this kindness would transform into cruelty. Morrison had seen this look before. It was the look of someone whose trust had been weaponized against them so many times that trust itself had become toxic. The distribution of food continued throughout the morning, but it progressed with agonizing slowness. For every prisoner who accepted a tin of soup, 3 more refused. For every child who reached for a piece of bread, a parent pulled them back with a sharp word and fearful eyes. The Americans had brought enough supplies to feed everyone in the camp twice over, yet most of the food remained in crates, untouched, while people who were starving stood meters away and refused to approach. Captain O'Brien, the chaplain, found himself surrounded by prisoners who peppered him with questions through the translator. How long until the Germans return? When will you execute us? What work will we be forced to do? The questions revealed the depth of their conditioning. They could not conceive of liberation as an end in itself. In their experience, nothing was ever free. Every kindness had carried a price. Every gift had been a prelude to greater suffering. Near the kitchens, a young German woman named Greta stood frozen before a table laden with bread loaves. An American soldier gestured for her to take as much as she wanted, but she couldn't move. The abundance was paralyzing. For 2 years, she had received 100 grams of bread per day, measured precisely. Any attempt to take more met with violence. Now she was being told to take freely, and her mind could not process the permission. She reached out once, twice, but each time her hand stopped centimeters from the bread, as if blocked by an invisible barrier. The soldier watched her struggle, then did something unexpected. He picked up a loaf and took a bite himself, chewing slowly, then offered it to her directly. The gesture said, "See? It's safe. It's real. Greta's fingers finally closed around the bread, and she pulled it to her chest like a drowning woman clutching driftwood. Then, something happened that no one in that moment fully understood. A little boy, no more than 4 years old, had been watching from behind his father's legs. He saw Greta take the bread. He saw that nothing bad happened to her, and he made a decision that would ripple through the camp like a stone dropped in still water. The boy's name was Otto, and he had been born inside Dachau. He had no memory of a world beyond the wire, no concept of what life looked like when it wasn't measured in rations and roll calls. But he understood one thing with perfect clarity. When the woman took the bread and didn't die, something fundamental had changed. He pulled free from his father's grip and walked toward the American soldier with the canteen, his bare feet padding across the mud with a determination that made several adults gasp. His father lunged forward to grab him, but Corporal Chen raised a hand gently, signaling the man to wait. Otto stopped in front of the canteen lying in the dirt and looked up at Chen with eyes that were far too old for his small face. Then he bent down, picked up the canteen with both hands, and drank. The water spilled down his chin and soaked his threadbare shirt, but he didn't stop until he had swallowed 3 full mouthfuls. When he finally lowered the canteen, he smiled. It was a strange, rusty smile, as if his face had forgotten how to make the expression. But it was real. That smile broke something in the watching crowd. A barrier that had held firm all morning suddenly cracked, and through that crack came a flood of desperate need. Within minutes, the line at the food distribution table grew from 5 people to 50. Mothers who had spent hours paralyzed by fear now pushed forward. Their children clutched against their chests. Men who had refused to approach the Americans now shuffled closer, their eyes still wary, but their hunger finally overcoming their terror. Private Donnelly watched Anna as she witnessed Otto's act of bravery. The little girl looked at the chocolate bar in her hands, then at the boy drinking from the canteen, then back at the chocolate. Her mother felt the shift in her daughter's body, the way tension transformed into something like resolve. Else wanted to stop her, wanted to pull her back, wanted to protect her from the disappointment if this turned out to be a trick after all. But she also understood that her daughter needed to take this step, needed to learn whether hope was allowed to exist again. Anna broke off a small piece of chocolate, so small it was barely a morsel. She held it up to the light, examining it as if it were a scientific specimen. Then she placed it on her tongue. The sweetness hit her like a physical shock. Her eyes went wide, and for a moment she looked frightened, as if the intensity of pleasure itself was dangerous. But then her face softened, and she took another small bite. This time, she chewed slowly, deliberately, savoring a taste she had never experienced in her young life. Her mother watched tears forming in her daughter's eyes, though whether they were tears of joy or grief or confusion, she couldn't tell. Perhaps they were all 3 at once. Throughout the camp, similar transformations were occurring in small, fragmented bursts. An elderly woman finally accepted a blanket from Lieutenant Morrison and wrapped it around her shoulders, then immediately began to weep with an intensity that shook her entire frame. A teenage boy took a tin of soup from a soldier, drank it in desperate gulps, then vomited it back up because his shrunken stomach couldn't process the richness. The soldier helped him sit down, gave him water, and waited patiently until the boy could try again, more slowly this time. Near the eastern barracks, 3 children discovered a crate of canned peaches the Americans had set out. They approached it like wild animals approaching a trap, circling, watching, testing. Finally, the oldest girl opened a can with trembling hands. The syrup inside gleamed like liquid gold in the afternoon sun. She dipped her finger in and tasted it, and the expression that crossed her face was something close to religious ecstasy. Within seconds, all 3 children were sharing the can, passing it between them with a reverence usually reserved for sacred rituals. But not everyone could take that step. In Barrack 22, a man named Friedrich sat on his bunk and refused to move. His wife had died 2 months earlier, and he had survived by becoming hollow, by removing every emotion that might cause pain. Now the Americans were asking him to feel again, to hope again, to believe that life could be something other than endurance. He couldn't do it. The risk was too great. So he sat in the darkness of the barrack while others ventured outside. and he told himself that staying was safer than hoping. A woman named Helene stood at the open gate, 1 foot inside the camp and 1 foot on the road beyond. She'd been standing there for over an hour, paralyzed by the threshold. Behind her lay 3 years of hell. Ahead lay a world she no longer knew how to navigate. She had a sister in Munich, or at least she had 3 years ago. But what if her sister was dead? What if her home was gone? What if the entire world outside had become just another kind of prison? At least here, in Dachau, she knew the rules. Out there, she would have to learn how to be human again, and she wasn't sure she remembered how. An American lieutenant named Robert Hayes approached her slowly, his translator beside him. He didn't rush her or demand she move. He simply stood nearby and waited, ready to answer questions if she had any. After several minutes of silence, Helene finally spoke. Wohin soll ich gehen? Where should I go? The translator conveyed the question, and Hayes felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. It wasn't really a question about geography. It was a question about purpose, about identity, about whether there was any place left in the world for people who had been broken this thoroughly. Hayes answered through the translator with the only truth he had. Anywhere you want. You're free. But freedom without direction felt like being lost, and for people who had spent years being told exactly where to stand, what to do, when to sleep, the absence of orders was its own kind of terror. Back near Barrack 17, Anna had finished half the chocolate bar. Her mother still held the other half, staring at it as if trying to decode a message written in a language she couldn't quite read. The chocolate had melted slightly in Elsa's palm, leaving a brown smear across her skin. She looked at the stain as if it were evidence of something, though she couldn't name what. Around her, the camp was filling with sounds it had never made before. The murmur of conversations between prisoners and soldiers, the clatter of tin cups being filled with soup, the occasional burst of a child's nervous laughter, quickly stifled by a parent's hand. These were the sounds of a world trying to remember how to be normal, but normal was a language none of them spoke fluently anymore. As the afternoon sun moved across the sky, the Americans began to understand that liberation was revealing wounds they had no training to treat. Private Donnelly sat on the ground near Anna and her mother, no longer offering anything, just present. He watched as Elsa finally raised the chocolate to her lips and took the smallest possible bite. She chewed mechanically, without pleasure, as if eating were a task to be completed, rather than an experience to be enjoyed. Her face remained expressionless, but her hands shook so violently that she had to press them against her knees to make them stop. In the men's section of the camp, Corporal Chen had managed to convince a group of prisoners to sit in a circle while he distributed cigarettes. They took them with gratitude, but several men simply held the cigarettes without lighting them, as if afraid that using them would mean they'd be taken away. One man, whose name was Klaus, finally lit his cigarette and inhaled deeply. The smoke filled his lungs, and for a moment his eyes closed in something that almost looked like peace. Then he opened them again, and the peace was gone, replaced by the same haunted vigilance that marked every face in the camp. Klaus had been a schoolteacher before Dachau, arrested for speaking against the regime in front of the wrong person. He had taught mathematics to children who looked like Otto and Anna, had believed in the power of education and reason. 3 years had taught him different lessons. That reason meant nothing when faced with systematic cruelty, that education couldn't save you from ideology, that the world was far more fragile than he had ever imagined. Now, he sat smoking an American cigarette, trying to remember what it felt like to think about the future instead of just surviving the next hour. Lieutenant Morrison had set up a makeshift medical station in one of the barracks, and a steady stream of prisoners came through with ailments that ranged from malnutrition to untreated infections to injuries that had healed wrong because there had been no medical care. But the cases that disturbed her most were the ones where nothing was physically wrong. A woman came in complaining of chest pain, but examination revealed a healthy heart. The pain, Morrison realized, was grief so profound it had become physical. A man came in unable to hear, but his ears were undamaged. The deafness was psychological, a shutting down of senses that had been overwhelmed by too much screaming. She treated what she could with the supplies she had, bandages, antibiotics, vitamins for the malnourished. But she found herself wishing desperately for medicines that didn't exist yet, treatments for wounds that had no visible scars. She watched a mother bring in her son who hadn't spoken in 6 months. The boy's throat was fine, his vocal cords undamaged. He had simply decided that speaking was too dangerous, that silence was safer. Morrison gave the mother vitamins and kind words, but both of them knew it wasn't enough. Outside, Captain O'Brien was discovering that his training as a chaplain had prepared him for grief, but not for this particular species of it. A woman asked him where God had been for the past 3 years, and he had no answer that didn't sound hollow. A man told him that he had prayed every night for 2 years, and his prayers had been met with silence and continued suffering. So why should he start praying again now? O'Brien wanted to offer comfort, wanted to speak of redemption and divine plans, but the words died in his throat. What comfort could theology offer to people who had lived through hell on earth? He found himself instead simply listening, bearing witness to stories that needed to be told even if there were no good responses to them. A woman described watching her sister die of typhus because the camp doctors wouldn't provide medicine. A man described being forced to help build the crematorium ovens, knowing what they would be used for. An elderly couple described being separated for 2 years, living in different sections of the same camp, seeing each other occasionally across the wire but never allowed to touch. They had been reunited this morning by the Americans, but they sat together now without speaking, without touching, as if the distance between them had become permanent, regardless of physical proximity. As evening approached, the Americans began to realize the full scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just a matter of providing food and medical care until the prisoners were strong enough to leave. Many of them had nowhere to go. Their homes had been destroyed, their families scattered or dead, their cities reduced to rubble by the same war that had ended their imprisonment. The Americans had liberated them from Dachau, but freedom meant stepping into a void where everything familiar had been erased. Sergeant Thomas Miller, who had fought his way across France and into Germany, found himself sitting with a group of German men who asked him what they were supposed to do now. He had no answer. The manual covered liberating camps, but not what came after. He could give them rations and blankets and medical care, but he couldn't give them back the lives they'd lost. He couldn't resurrect their dead or rebuild their homes or erase the memories that would wake them screaming in the middle of the night for the rest of their lives. He sat with them in silence, and the silence felt like the most honest thing any of them had shared all day. The afternoon was fading into evening now, shadows lengthening across the compound and the temperature beginning to drop. Near the gate, Helene had been standing in the same position for over an hour, 1 foot inside the camp and 1 foot on the road beyond. She had not moved, had barely blinked, her entire body frozen in the act of choosing between 2 impossible worlds. The road ahead looked empty and infinite. The camp behind her looked familiar and suffocating. She stood balanced on the threshold, waiting for something to tell her which way to step, but the only voice she could hear was her own fear. That's when Private David Sullivan noticed her. He had been helping with the evening supply distribution when he saw the woman standing motionless at the gate, her posture suggesting someone caught between drowning and swimming. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her, and when he reached her side, he didn't speak or demand anything. He simply stood beside her, looking out at the same road she was staring at, as if willing to wait as long as it took for her to make her decision. The patience in his stillness suggested he understood what she was wrestling with. He didn't speak German, and she didn't speak English, but he stood beside her anyway, looking out at the same road she was staring at. After a while, he pulled out a photograph from his wallet and showed it to her. It was a picture of a street in Philadelphia, rows of brick houses with white steps, a tree-lined sidewalk where children played. He pointed to one house, then to himself, trying to convey the simple idea that somewhere in the world, normal life still existed, that streets still had houses, that houses still had families, that the world beyond Dachau hadn't entirely disappeared. Helene looked at the photograph for a long time, studying the details as if they were clues to a puzzle she needed to solve. The children in the picture were smiling. The street looked clean, undamaged, peaceful. It seemed impossible that such a place could exist in the same world as the camp behind her. She handed the photo back to Sullivan, and he saw that her eyes were wet. She nodded once, a gesture that might have meant thank you or might have meant I understand or might have meant I'm trying to believe you. Then she took her foot off the campground and placed both feet on the road. She didn't walk away, not yet, but she was no longer straddling the threshold. It was a small movement, but Sullivan understood it was enormous. Throughout the camp, American soldiers were engaged in similar small acts of bridge building, trying to close the distance between the prisoners' trauma and their own inability to fully comprehend it. Corporal Chen had started a chess game with Klaus using pieces carved from soap. Neither of them spoke the other's language well, but chess needed no translation. They played slowly, carefully, and Chen noticed that Klaus thought about each move for minutes at a time, as if the game represented something far more important than the movement of pieces on a board. Perhaps it did. Perhaps choosing where to move a knight was Klaus's way of practicing having choices again, of remembering that decisions could be about strategy instead of survival. In the medical barracks, Lieutenant Morrison had convinced the mother of the silent boy to let him stay overnight for observation. She suspected the boy needed time away from the barracks, away from the constant reminders of his imprisonment, to find his voice again. She set up a cot for him near her desk and gave him paper and colored pencils that had been donated by a relief organization. The boy, whose name was Peter, stared at the colors as if he'd never seen such things before. Then, tentatively, he picked up a red pencil and began to draw. What emerged on the paper was not the cheerful drawing of a typical child. Peter drew the barracks in careful detail, the wire fence, the guard tower. But in his drawing, the gate was open and stick figures were walking out of it. Some of the figures had their arms raised, not in surrender, but in something that might have been celebration or might have been confusion. Morrison watched him draw and felt her throat tighten. The boy was trying to process what had happened, trying to make sense of liberation through the only language he still trusted, images instead of words. As darkness fell over Dachau, the Americans set up floodlights powered by generators, illuminating the camp in a harsh white glow that was nothing like the searchlights that had hunted for escapees during the years of imprisonment. These lights were meant to provide safety, to show that the darkness held no more hidden threats. But for many prisoners, any bright light at night triggered memories of terror. They flinched away from the illumination and retreated into the shadows of the barracks, where the familiar darkness felt paradoxically safer than the unfamiliar light. Private Donnelly had been relieved of duty and told to get some rest, but he found he couldn't leave. He sat outside Barrack 17, his back against the wooden wall, and listened to the sounds of the night. Crying came from several barracks, not the wailing of fresh grief, but the steady, exhausted weeping of people who had held everything inside for so long that now, in safety, it all came pouring out. He heard prayers in German, whispered conversations, the creaking of bunks as people tried to sleep but couldn't. He heard the camp breathing, trying to believe it was allowed to rest. Anna appeared in the doorway of the barrack, her small silhouette framed by the dim light from inside. She was still holding what remained of the chocolate bar, now reduced to a few small pieces. She looked at Donnelly, and he looked back at her, and something passed between them that needed no words. She walked over and sat down beside him, not touching, maintaining a careful distance but choosing to be near him. They sat together in silence for several minutes, and then Anna did something unexpected. She broke off a piece of chocolate and offered it to him. Donnelly felt his eyes sting with tears he hadn't known were there. The gesture was so simple, so profound. This child, who had been terrified to accept the chocolate in the first place, was now choosing to share it. It was an act of trust, of generosity, of reclaiming her humanity one small decision at a time. He took the piece of chocolate and ate it, and it tasted like the sweetest thing he'd ever had. Not because of the sugar, but because of what it represented, the beginning of healing, the first fragile threads of connection between two people who had been designated as enemies, but who were discovering they were simply human. Else appeared in the doorway and watched her daughter sitting beside the American soldier. Every instinct told her to pull Anna away, to protect her, to maintain distance, but she also saw something in her daughter's face that she hadn't seen in 3 years, a kind of peace, however temporary, however fragile. So she let them sit together, and she stood in the doorway as a silent witness to a small miracle occurring in the darkness. The night deepened, and the camp grew quieter, though sleep came fitfully to most. The generators hummed through the night, a mechanical lullaby that was strange but not threatening, and gradually some prisoners began to drift into the kind of sleep they hadn't experienced in years, sleep without the fear of being woken by shouting or violence. But for others, the silence itself was disturbing. They had grown so accustomed to the sounds of suffering that the absence of screaming felt like a void they didn't know how to fill. Friedrich, the man who had refused to leave his bunk, lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet, and finding it unbearable. In suffering, at least, there had been a kind of certainty. In peace, there was only the terrifying question of what came next. Morning arrived with a gentleness that felt almost apologetic, as if the sun itself was unsure whether it had permission to shine on Dachau. The Americans had been working through the night, and by dawn they had established more organized systems, a mess hall with hot food, a processing station where prisoners could register their names, a communications post where people could try to send messages to relatives who might still be alive. The camp was transforming from a site of death into something that resembled, however imperfectly, a place of recovery. Otto, the little boy who had been first to drink from the canteen, was now following the American soldiers around like a shadow, his eyes bright with curiosity about these strange men who spoke a different language and seemed to have endless supplies of food. He had assigned himself as Corporal Chen's unofficial assistant, carrying things, pointing out prisoners who needed help, slowly rebuilding his understanding of what adults could be, protectors instead of tormentors. Anna had ventured farther from her mother's side, exploring the camp with a tentative courage that grew stronger each hour. She discovered that the Americans had brought toys, simple things like balls and dolls donated by relief organizations, and she watched other children playing with them as if observing a ritual from a foreign culture. Play was something she barely remembered. The concept of doing something for joy rather than survival seemed alien, but she was learning. Klaus and Corporal Chen had progressed beyond chess. They had begun having halting conversations about ordinary things, the weather, the quality of the coffee, the birds returning to the trees around the camp. These mundane topics were themselves a form of healing, a reminder that life could be about simple observations rather than constant crisis. Klaus found himself laughing at something Chen said, a joke about the terrible coffee, and the sound of his own laughter startled him. He couldn't remember the last time he had laughed. By the third day, some prisoners had begun to leave. Those who had family elsewhere, or who at least believed they might, started making their way toward the roads that led to towns and cities whose current states they could only guess at. The Americans provided them with food, blankets, maps, and papers, documenting their status as liberated prisoners. They left in small groups, walking slowly, looking back over their shoulders as if the camp might somehow follow them. But many remained. Some were too weak to travel. Others had nowhere to go. Still others had discovered that the camp, despite everything it represented, had become the only community they knew. The other prisoners understood their trauma in ways the outside world never could. Here, they didn't have to explain why sudden noises made them flinch or why they hoarded food. Here, everyone understood. Helene had walked down the road that first evening, made it about 2 kilometers before panic overwhelmed her, and she turned back. She returned to find David Sullivan still on duty, and when he saw her, he didn't look surprised. He simply nodded, acknowledging that leaving was harder than it looked, that freedom was something you had to learn to inhabit. She lay down thinking that maybe tomorrow she'd try again. Maybe tomorrow she'd make it 3 kilometers. Friedrich finally emerged from Barrack 22 on the 4th day. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't explain where he'd been. He simply walked to the mess hall, accepted a bowl of soup, and sat down at a table where other men were eating in silence. They made room for him without comment, understanding that everyone moved toward healing at their own pace. Private Donnelly was reassigned after a week, his unit moving on to other duties. On his last day, he found Anna and her mother and said goodbye in the awkward way of people who share no common language but who have shared something profound. Anna gave him a drawing she had made, a picture of a girl and a soldier, and a chocolate bar. He folded it carefully and put it in the same pocket where he'd carried the chocolate, and he carried it with him for the rest of his life. The camp slowly emptied over the following weeks. Some prisoners recovered enough to leave, others were transferred to displaced persons camps, still others remained until the facility was officially closed. But the psychological liberation came at different times for different people. For some, it was the first bite of chocolate. For others, the first night of uninterrupted sleep. For Friedrich, it was the morning he woke up thinking about the future instead of just surviving the present. For Helene, it was the day she walked down that road and didn't turn back. The real story lived in the small moments, the chess games, the shared chocolate, the patient waiting. It lived in the discovery that freedom was not a moment but a process, not a gate opening but a long road walked one difficult step at a time.